Padarn. Good morning and warm welcome from me, Chris Burr, and the rest of the CMD team at St Padarn's. You join us for the final in our series of 8 webinars looking at the challenges and possibilities of developing our online ministries that have come into sharp focus in recent months. As with the rest of the series, this particular webinar will be recorded and placed on the Ministry Hub section of the St Padarn's website, along with any handouts and further reading matter from today's subjects. Over the past 2 weeks, we've covered a wide variety of issues linked to digital ministry, hopefully offering some food for thought along the way, as well as hearing from some excellent contributors who've been kind enough to share their own experiences and their expertise with us. We'll continue to hold occasional webinars around digital ministry, even once this particular series concludes, mindful that our ministerial landscape is changing all the time. So today we're going to look at some very practical issues and principles around digital ministry that impact how and what we do. In order to help us with that, I'm delighted to welcome Matthew Chinery, Tina Andrew, and Emma Leighton-Jones. Matthew is Head of Legal Services here in the Church in Wales. He will be addressing some of the issues around copyright and licenses. Tina is the Church Conservation and Support Manager for the Church in Wales. Will be reminding us about the procedures which may come into play to enable us to expand our online ministries. And Emma is the lead safeguarding trainer here at St Padarn's. Grateful to all 3 of them for giving up their time to help us today. But just before we begin, for those who may be joining one of these webinars for the first time, let me just briefly explain the format. Between them, Matthew, Tina and Emma will speak for around 45 minutes or so, and that will be followed by a period of up to 30 minutes, which we set aside at the end for questions and further discussion. If one of them is speaking and a question comes to mind that you'd like them to answer, or perhaps expand or clarify something, please post that via the Q&A button, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. My colleagues Veronica and Jen will then collate these, and these will be used as the basis for our Q&As at the end of today's session. Please note that we may not have time to deal with all the questions, and if we have a few questions broadly touching on the same subject, then we'll probably just use one of those. So apologies in advance if we don't use or have time to come to your particular question, but we'll do our best in the time that we have. If you prefer to ask a question anonymously, you can do that. You just enable the anonymity feature before you pose your question, and then your name won't come up. As I mentioned earlier, if you missed something or if you'd like to go back and hear today's webinar again, it is being recorded and will be available to view on the Ministerial Hub section of the St Padarn's website, along with the other 7 in this series. And our aim is to make that available to view within the next couple of days, as I said, along with any handouts or further information. Finally, you will automatically receive in the next 48 hours a feedback request. It's very short and very straightforward, but we'd be really grateful if you could just take a moment to fill that out. There are 75 of us registered for our webinar today, so hopefully you'll appreciate why we can't make it any more interactive than it is and why we can't allow people to ask questions out loud as we go along. It's also why we only show the speakers in view rather than all of the attendees as well, to make that less distracting for people. Now, that's more than enough for me for now. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to our first contributor, who is Matthew Chinery. So good morning, Matthew, and welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Good morning to all of you. I don't want to unduly dampen expectations on this, but as I think the title of this particular part of the talk probably gives away, this is a little bit heavy on detail and light on jokes, and I'm very sorry for that, but I hope it will be of use in explaining to you some of the very complicated but navigable difficulties we have with copyright, as we were all suddenly plunged into this new way of being in terms of ministering to our congregations online. Like any good lawyer, I will start by scaring you a little bit. In 2013, I'm aware of a Church of England congregation who put a short poem in a weekly newsletter, which they also, as with all their newsletters, just put onto their website, so people could download the newsletter without necessarily having to be in church. A few weeks later, that church received a demand from the publisher of this poem for £7,000 in compensation for breach of copyright. There was lots of scared emails, calls to a legal department, some advice, so on and so forth. After much angst, some considerable legal advice, lots of time, and eventually some pleas to the publisher to have mercy on this little church charity. The case was settled out of court for around £1,500 plus legal fees. That case is not unique. I'm also aware of claims in recent years against a choir for using unlawfully photocopied sheet music, and against a church for using a copyright image in a PowerPoint presentation, which was being used as a visual aid in a sermon. Just as with the poem, I think the reason this particular preacher was caught out with that image was that the PowerPoint presentation had been uploaded to his church's website. Technology has come a very long way in this area, and it has now reached a stage where machines are automatically searching the internet for copyright material and unlawful reproductions of it, and then automatically sending alerts to whoever holds the rights to that piece of music or that image or that video, so that they can get their lawyers or a claims company to make a claim against those infringers. So as so much of our lives together have moved into the online world, I think the chances of getting caught in this area have increased significantly. I suppose an increased chance of being caught might be seen as the key incentive to give this area close attention. But I think for Christians, and particularly Christians in leadership, that really should not be the primary motivation here. I can't imagine that any of you would condone your staff members or your volunteers shoplifting for your communion wine. And why should we treat the laws relating to intellectual property so different from those relating to physical property? I'll start with a little bit of a general introduction as to what copyright law is and how it applies, and then we'll look at some of the specifics that relate to churches and particularly to online worship. The laws of England and Wales, in common with pretty much all the developed world and most of the developing world, has a complex system of laws which protects the creation and the monetization of intellectual property. There are certain minimum standards for these set out in some international treaties, but then several countries choose to go above and beyond. Rights to use and distribute that property as they see fit. So as a creator of a work, and it's a different level of protection in different circumstances, I'm given a period of time where I am given exclusive rights to that work. For scientific discoveries, it's quite a short period of time, 20 years. But for the things we're concerned about, it's a much longer period. And different rules also apply depending on how the content is to be distributed. Broadcasting content online is different to reading it out or singing it in a church building. This is particularly important to understand in the church context because there are copyright exemptions that apply to performing copyright music or other creative material as part of a live act of worship, but only if that's a live act of worship in a building. Those do not apply if that worship is then put online or broadcast. So copyright doesn't last forever. It can be fiendishly complicated, and I'll go into those details in a second. But a nice basic rule of thumb is that almost anything published since the year 1900 has a good chance of being copyright. And the more recent, the newer the publication, the greater the likelihood is that that material is copyright. In this country, copyright is automatic. You don't have to do anything to create a copyright other than create that work. You don't need to register it. You don't need to put that little C in a circle that you see at the bottom of pages of books and things like that. It simply applies automatically. Copyright in literary, dramatic, musical and artistic work tends to last for 70 years from the end of the calendar year that the author died. If there are multiple authors, it is 70 years from the end of the calendar year that the last surviving author died. So what that means is, as we sit here in August 2020, if any author of the material you want to use died in 1950 or later, or indeed is still alive today, then the work is likely in copyright. To give some context for that in relation to churches and in relation to church music, this means that 5 of the nation's top 10 hymns, as voted for in a 2013 BBC survey, are in copyright, and 5 of them are not because they're older than that. And you have to be very careful, because some hymns really surprised me when I realized they were still in copyright. How Great Thou Art was the hymn that came top of that survey of the BBC. That feels to me like an old hymn. But the version that we sing today was translated by somebody who died in 1989. So that is not just only in copyright, it's going to be in copyright for many years still to come. Some hymns we might sing to words which are out of copyright, but to a more modern musical setting or tune, such as in my church at least, How Shall I Sing That Majesty is a very old hymn. It's about 300 years old in terms of the words, but we sing it to a 20th century tune that's still in copyright. And I'm afraid it gets even more complicated than that. If you've got words and a tune that are an old hymn, but the words have been changed a little bit, then a new copyright comes into being for the person who's made that adaptation. This means that it's likely, for example, that any hymn that's been altered to adopt gender-neutral or inclusive language is probably copyright, because the chances are that has been done in relatively recent years. If something is old enough not to be in copyright, this is known as a public domain work. You are legally free to record yourself, record your organist, record your worship band, or hopefully, if government restrictions allow, record your choir performing these songs. You can then upload those songs to your streams and your online worship. However, you're not free to use other people's recordings or videos of these songs, because separate copyright rules apply to sound and video recordings. Any sound recording published since 1963 is still in copyright. Copyright on videos is the most complicated thing. I'm not sure I quite get all the nuances, but there's a minimum of 50 years on copyright on videos, 50 years since broadcast, or if it's deemed to be a creative work or a film, 70 years after the death of all those people involved. I think that means it's very unlikely that sound recordings or videos that we would want to use in our streams are going to be public domain. The chances are all of those are going to be in copyright. Now, you cannot use copyright works in your online worship without the relevant permissions. So now I just want to have a quick look at how we might go about getting those permissions. I'm afraid this is still unavoidably complicated, because there are at least 4 different types of permissions that might be needed to do the sorts of things we want to be doing in our online worship. I will go through all of those as best I can, and I will share a chart on the screen at the end which tries to summarize it, and that will also be available to be distributed as after the end of this. And of course, if there are any questions, I will try and answer those at the end. The rights include performance rights, print rights, sync rights, and mechanical rights. And I will do my best to explain what each of those are as we go along. In relation to many of the things we do, we might be able to go directly to the relevant copyright owners who can give us permission either on a case-by-case basis or on a general basis. Now, there's a really obvious example of this in the Church in Wales that you might not have thought of. The liturgies of the Church in Wales, those contained in our Book of Common Prayer and in our alternative liturgies approved by governing body, are in fact copyright works. But the owner of that copyright is the representative body of the Church in Wales, and they have given permission to parishes to use that liturgy in its worship. It would be very silly if they didn't, but that permission also extends to streaming our worship. So the actual words in our authorised services, you have permission to use. Moving on to something perhaps slightly more commercially minded, a number of publishing companies of music and of texts have banded together to offer churches licenses to permit them to use that material. Now, these licenses will permit certain uses of copyright material by churches. There are a couple of commercial providers out there, and I don't necessarily want to recommend any one over the others, but I think the most well-known of those in the church context is CCLI. Many churches will already have a CCLI license for certain things. That can include reproducing words or sheet music of songs or hymns in your orders of service Sunday by Sunday. It may also give you permission to put them on a projector screen if you have one of those in your church. And so that's a very common CCLI license, and that relates to print rights, the right to print certain copyright works in your printed material or in your projected material. Now, CCLI have recently introduced a streaming license, which you get on top of your print license, and that allows works that they control the copyright for to be streamed online. A competitor to CCLI called One License offers a similar package, but for a different set of songs, different set of hymns, and a different set of publishers. It rather depends on what the sort of songs and materials your church uses Sunday by Sunday, whether one or other of those packages of hymns or songs is more appropriate for you. You may need both of them to cover your usual repertoire of material. You might find the odd song or hymn that's not covered by either license. For the technically minded amongst you, that streaming license is what legally is known as a sync license. It permits the synchronization of a copyright piece of music to an online video, and your live stream of your church service for these purposes is an online video. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't quite cover everything. A sync license might not be the only license that you need. An online broadcast of a service is also treated in law as a performance of a copyright work. And yes, you've guessed it, you may also need a performance license to perform this. Now, CCLI and One License don't cover this, so it's a separate license, but there are some exceptions which I'll come to in a minute. This license is available from the Performing Rights Society, and the appropriate license in most cases is what's known as a limited online music license. However, there is, as I say, an important exception here. There are certain websites who have negotiated that license already on your behalf. So this means currently, as things stand today, if you put your online services through YouTube, through Facebook video, or through Instagram, the performance license has already been sorted. You may still need your license from CCLI, One License, or another sync license. And you may also need print licenses if you're displaying lyrics on your screen. But it depends on the platform you are using whether you need a performance license. So for services on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, you only need a sync license in most cases. For anything else, and that does include private streams of worship, including through Zoom on a password protected stream, you are likely to need both a sync license and a performance license. Now, the difficulty some churches, particularly those without great musical resources, will find is that none of these licenses give you permission to use the actual copyright sound recordings or videos, because these are, again, a separate sort of copyright known as mechanical rights. There is not, unfortunately, currently a licensing solution that anybody's come up for this, and that's really frustrating for churches. So if you want to use somebody else's sound or video, as opposed to the songs themselves, singing yourself, playing the organ yourself, as I see it, there are three realistic options. The first option is to make your own recordings, as I mentioned earlier on. Now, this could be your organist, it could be your worship band, it could be, as I'm sure you may have seen various churches doing on YouTube, these little videos where everybody's recorded at home and you get little boxes with different singers in, and it's all brought together. Hopefully soon, government guidance permitting, we may be able to get choirs together, carefully socially distanced, to make some recordings. But if you have the facilities to do those things yourself, then that is one way you can get around this issue. The second way is to find recordings which the copyright holders have given permission to be used. Now, this might be on a case-by-case basis. You can go to people who have uploaded their own YouTube videos and ask for permission to use it in your stream. But there are also organisations and groups of people who have effectively given blanket permission, at least during the COVID crisis, for material to be used. The Diocese of St David's, to take one example, has a range of public domain hymns, old hymns, recorded by the cathedral choir and by others, and they've put those on their website with permission for these to be used by parishes. There is a link to that available, which I will both display and we can get sent round. St Paul's Cathedral in London has done something similar with a project called Choir of the Nation, where they got singers from all around the country to record and send in some audio recordings. Those have all been stitched together, and they're now available for people to use free of charge in their streams. For more modern music, there are a few publishers and artists who are giving permission for their music, including videos in certain cases, to be used. You can just embed those videos into your streams. Again, there's a huge number, and I don't commend any one over the others, but there are publishers including Resound Worship, Getty Music, Sovereign Grace Music, and we'll put some links up to that at the end. And I think the third option, which will work in some cases and not others, is rather than putting this music directly into your streams or your online worship, you can give your congregation links to existing YouTube videos, or to something like a playlist on Spotify, or some other thing that's already been put on the internet by somebody else. And if you're clever about it, particularly with pre-recorded worship, you may be able to get your congregation to watch the video of your service, then click on the thing for the hymn, then come back to your service. Now, it's not ideal, and it will work better in some contexts than others, but I'm afraid we are looking for legal ways around this very difficult area. I'm just now going to share a screen, which hopefully you can all see that now. It's just a little table of the different types of rights and use, and the best solutions we have to come up for them. As you can see, if you're performing a copyright song to an audience, you need some performance rights for that, and you need a license to permit the performance rights if you're doing it online. The relevant license that you need is a PRS license. If you're displaying copies of lyrics or musical notation, you will likely need print rights for that, and you're looking at a license from CCLI, one license, or one of the other providers for that. If you are using a copyright song in a video, that's sync rights, and that's the streaming license I've talked about. And then, unfortunately, if you want to use a video or audio of somebody else singing or playing a particular track, we are then dealing with mechanical rights, and there is no good licensing solution for that. You can approach those publishers directly. You can look online for people who've already given permission, or if you have the resources and ability, you can make your own recording. There's other things you will need to think about in your online worship. Photographs is a big area of copyright infringement on the internet. Just because a photograph has been put somewhere on the internet doesn't necessarily give you permission to use it. However, the internet is full of websites and places where rights-free images are available. So what that means is either you can download a free image, or you may have to pay a couple of pounds for the image. But once you have that image, you're allowed to do what you like with it, including using that as part of your online worship. And then the one other thing to say about all of this is lots of these licenses and these permissions have some terms and conditions attached. Now, what these often are saying that a copyright acknowledgement has to be part of is part of the basis for granting permission. Now, if you're doing a service in a building, that's probably really easy. And if you go to any major church service, for example, that the church in Wales puts on at diocesan or provincial level, you'll usually find the last page of the order of service is full of copyright acknowledgements saying who are the copyright holders and various things, stating what licenses the relevant church has and giving license numbers and things like that. You do need to check the T's and C's of your licenses or the terms of any permissions given, and it may be that you have to include a copyright acknowledgement. That probably won't be a spoken acknowledgement, but if you're putting your worship online, it may be that you need to add that in the comments, in the text bit underneath, at the bottom of the screen, underneath the video and things like that. It would be really unfortunate if a church has gone through really carefully, got all the right licenses, carefully paid all the money to people, and then it actually finds out that it hasn't used the license correctly because of small print such as that. This is all a nightmare, and I can't sugarcoat that. It's getting better. We're in a better position now in terms of licenses that are available in August than we were in March. But what I would say is, quite apart from the importance of keeping to the letter of the law, getting these licenses and doing this properly is an investment in the future of church music. These licenses allow royalties to be paid to those songwriters, those hymn writers, those musicians. They enable songwriters to continue to devote their time composing this music that means so much to our communities and to our worship together. I'm just going to move on briefly just to give some links. Now these can all be these will all be put in a slightly more useful format for you, so you can click on them and look at them. There's a couple of guides to churches and copyright where you know, lots of bits of this lecture have been based on. The Law and Religion UK blog has a very useful one, and then there's an even more detailed one on one of the music publishers' website. I've given links to places where you can get the relevant licenses. And also I've given a couple examples of people who've made some audio or video recordings available. For uses by churches and by parishes in this, this quite remarkable time. So that's all you have from me on that. I look forward to doing my best to answer any questions that people have once you've heard from my colleagues. So thank you very much indeed, Chris.
Matthew, thank you very much for that. Lots of great practical information there, and I'm sure many of those attending today will go back and watch this back again. There's just a few questions that we have there that I wonder if it's worth now, actually, rather than at the end of the session together, because they're quite specific to what you've talked about. Yeah. So one from Alison here. Is it okay to use something such as a picture or some music on a recorded service that's then posted online, providing it's attributed?
Short answer is no. So, if the service takes place in a building, you've probably got an exemption there for the music, for the service live in the building. you may actually be infringing copyright by using a picture in that, unless you own the picture or you've got permission. But then once you post it online, that is a separate thing. That is a publication. It's a publication online, and you do need the relevant licenses in place, or you are likely infringing copyright on that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. Question from Daniel. Should we put our CCLI license numbers on our YouTube videos?
Right, the lawyer's answer to that is you will need to check carefully what the terms and conditions of your CCLI license are. I don't have the license in front of me, but I think it does say that you should put your CCLI license on anything that you're using. So I think the answer to that is yes. That can easily be done in the small print at the bottom of your description of what your service is in the text box on YouTube.
Okay, thank you for that. A question from Karen. Does video cover the performance license in the same way as YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram do?
So Vimeo is another video platform, as I understand it. I don't believe that they do. I haven't seen any evidence that they do. So I think you would probably need to look at a limited online music license to make sure your legal I's and T's are dotted if you're using Vimeo.
One from Sean here. Where do we stand with screen sharing a YouTube video? Zoom.
That is a wonderful question in terms of trying to get around this. I have to say the short answer to that is I don't know. It's probably somewhere deep in the terms and conditions or the license of what you use YouTube for. I would imagine it's probably technically against the terms and conditions of using YouTube, but I don't know off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
I do appreciate it. We're really some very detailed and technical questions, so I really appreciate that. Another one from Alison. Is everything on Wikicommons okay to use? Okay, so Wikicommons has a load of material that generally has slightly more liberal allowances for use. I haven't been through their full terms and conditions. My understanding is the purpose of that is giving material that people are allowed to use and things like this, but you would have to check the T's and C's of Wikicommons carefully just to see what uses they do allow. It's often non-commercial uses, and our view is that church services are non-commercial. So you will have to just check the small print on that, but I would hope you'd be okay with that. Okay, thank you. Question from Sister Marion. How are we covered leading services from our homes? Leading services from homes on the face of it is no different from leading services in churches. My understanding is that most of the licensing companies have agreed, particularly during the pandemic, that your church license covers ministers from your church or members of your church leading services from home on the basis that you're only doing it from home in most cases because you can't be doing it from your church. Now, technically, that's up to each licensing company to decide, and obviously I can't speak for all of them, and I haven't reviewed the small print of all the licensing companies, but that is how I understand most licensing companies are interpreting it. I think that's a really important point, isn't it? Because just because we're not physically in our church buildings, we're still maintaining that ministry and working on behalf of the church in Wales. Exactly. So, even though the physical parameters may change, what we're doing and what we're representing is the same. And I suppose that's a common principle then, Matthew, is it? That's the logic. And the publishing companies, the licensing companies want to be helpful on this because they want their music out there. They just want to be fairly recompensed for it. So they're keen to make sure that there are opportunities for their copyright works to be used, and they, as I understand it, they're taking a fair and reasonable approach on this, which is entirely sensible. Okay, that's great. I'm just giving everyone a 2-minute warning because there's a couple more questions to put to Matthew, but bless him, we're kind of asking a lot of stuff at the moment. So if you've got a question for Matthew, if you can just pop that in the Q&A now, because once we come to the end of this part and we go on to Tina and Emma, knowing what Matthew's got on his plate at the moment, probably we can let Matthew go rather than keep him holding on until 12:15. So if you've got a specific question for Matthew, if you can just pop that in now, in that particular section. For Malcolm, what happens when YouTube indicates a copyright infringement, even when recorded by ourselves?
This drives me up the wall. So what happens here is old works which are in the public domain. Let's just say something written in 1820. I record it and I put it on YouTube. I've done everything absolutely properly here. I've been really careful, and there is no copyright infringement here. But one of the ways that YouTube and Facebook video make their money and assist the publishing companies is have automatic bots, computers crawling the internet looking for copyright infringing materials. And often things are incorrectly flagged as copyright infringing when they're not. This has happened to me personally. I am a musician as well. Other than continually writing stroppy messages to YouTube and Facebook, which I have done on this precise topic, unfortunately there is nothing you can do. Now, the way you can eliminate this is by not using YouTube or Facebook. If you put the videos on your own website, then those automatic bots and those automatic takedowns don't happen. I'm hoping the technology is going to get better on this, because it's hugely frustrating, and it's particularly frustrating if you spend hours and hours trying to do things properly, doing things properly, and your video's struck down anyway. That is Facebook's fault, that is YouTube's fault. There are lots of us who are continuously telling them that their bots aren't working properly in this area, but we are a relatively small voice put up against Mark Zuckerberg et al. And all the resources they have behind them and all the billions of users that they have. We'll keep raising this with them, and hopefully it will get better, but I'm sorry, there's not a good answer for that. It is absolutely infuriating.
I think it was a very good answer to that, Matthew. Final question from Sister Marion then. In some ways, I think it'd be good if we had a bit more detail on this question, but she said, can we use anything as long as it's not recorded? Okay, so need to distinguish on that question. If you're doing things live as an act of worship, physically together, most things there are copyright exemptions for, in terms of singing copyright songs as part of an act of worship. If you're putting it online through Zoom or any other platform, whether or not it is recorded, that is treated in law as an online broadcast, and you need the licenses. Now, there is an obvious point, I think, that if something's not recorded and it's only live, you might be less likely in being caught out on it because the evidence isn't on the internet for everybody to see. But I do not think that is a good or acceptable reason to do it, because you're less likely to get caught. As I say, there are strong ethical and moral reasons why you should be compensating people fairly, in terms of those people who spend their professional lives, their time, their energy and their own money in developing these wonderful musical and artistic works for our enjoyment. And they have rights protected in law. And whether or not we're going to get caught if we infringe them, we should be respecting and acting in accordance with those laws. Thank you. I think that's a really good point, actually, Matthew, to finish with. It's not just the technicalities, is it, of us being caught out by things, but it's the reason why these things are in place in the first place. And as ministers, as leaders, you know, we preach a gospel, don't we, that's based on morals and ethics and good news. So it's about practicing what we preach as well, and paying what we do. So really, really grateful to you this morning. I feel we've worked you particularly hard. Thank you, everybody, for those questions for Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. Apologies, we put you on the spot with some quite technical stuff there. I think you did brilliantly answering that. And if there's no more questions from Matthew, just on behalf of everyone, to thank you for your time this morning, to enjoy the rest of the day. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, Matthew.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Okay. So we're going to move on now to Tina. As I mentioned, Tina is going to talk about faculties to us. Now, Tina, One of the questions that somebody asked me a little while ago that kind of alarmed me really is saying in an off-the-cuff message really that, well, a lot of the rules around faculties don't apply anymore, do they, at this particular time? And I thought, right, well, we need to bring Tina on to hear a little bit more about this, because obviously just because the landscape's changed for us, it doesn't mean that all of the rules, regulations and processes that we adhere to have gone out the window. So if I can hand over to you, and the same, if you've got questions for Tina as we go along, if you can just pop them in there, and at the end of that session then we'll put those directly to Tina before we move on to Emma. So Tina, welcome.
Thank you. Well, good morning everybody. Padarn. My name is Tina Andrew. I'm the Church Conservation Support Manager for the Church in Wales. And for my sins, I also look after the online faculty system. So those of you already familiar with it will know that it is an online system these days, and I'm the person who administers it. So I've got a short presentation for you so that you don't have to look at me for very long. But what Chris said is not true. So he was told that you don't need a faculty in these troubled pandemic times. The short answer is yes, you do need a faculty. But let me go through the whole regular process, and then I'll speak to you at the end about pandemic specific advice. But the bottom line really is, okay, it is difficult times, but you really do need faculty. Each diocese has taken a slightly different approach to, I wouldn't say relaxing the rules, but trying to actually put faculties through quicker, perhaps, than they would normally. So let me start the presentation and we'll take it from there. Okay, there you go. So I think you can probably see me and the presentation. So just moving on. Now, I am assuming, correctly or incorrectly, that you all know what a faculty is. If not, this is just a quick reminder for you. So faculty itself is the church's system of building permission. So it's analogous in many respects to the secular system of listed building consent. So if you need any repairs or alterations, changes to the church or the churchyard or some of the contents, you will need faculty permission to do it. So faculty rules are enshrined in the Church in Wales Constitution, and each diocese operates the faculty system in their own area. So although it is a universal system that is available across all 6 dioceses of the Church in Wales, it is administered in each diocese by diocesan officers. So it means legally that we are exempt from the need to apply for listed building consent for any works to our listed churches or items within it. So you often get listed tombs or listed churchyard walls or listed preaching crosses. So you don't need to apply for listed building consent to the local authority. If I had a listed building myself, I lived in it, then I would need always to apply for permission to do any works to it, any changes to it. And that will be done through the local planning authority. So the Church in Wales isn't the only exempt denomination. There are probably about 6 others. So Catholics, I think, Baptists, Methodists at the moment, although one or two are withdrawing and actually taking themselves out of the exemption, going through the local planning authority system. However, since we own the lion's share of places of worship, we won't be doing that anytime soon because, quite frankly, local planning authorities wouldn't be able to cope with the traffic, as they say. So, as I said earlier, each diocese operates the faculty system. How you do it is you apply for permission using an online form, and you do that via the online faculty system itself. Back in the day, i.e. a few years ago, this was all done as a paper-based system. So you would fill out a faculty application form and you would submit it to the DAC, the secretary would process it, and it would be looked at by the DAC. What happened when we introduced the online faculty system 2.5 years ago now? We actually introduced several different types of applications. So we've now got what we call List A, List B, and full applications. So a List A application is literally just for very minor works, and it covers mainly routine maintenance. So if you want to clear gutters, if you want to clear drains, very minor bits of work, say a tiny patch of repointing. There is a however though. I would always speak to my DAC secretary first, just to make sure that it truly is a List A. We call it List A and List B because when you're actually making the application, you move through a series of screens. So the first screen you come to is the List A, and it asks you to select the type of work that you will be doing. If it's not on List A, then you will be shown the List B screen. So then you have a look through there and see if the work that you want to do is a List B. If it's not on there, then by default, the faculty becomes a full faculty. And the full faculty is analogous to the old paper-based faculty. So the other two, the List A and List B, were brought in, if you like, to kind of streamline the old system, because having a full faculty application for just about anything bar changing a light bulb was very time consuming and very tedious. So that's why we've got these different types of faculty application now. Okay, so to use the online faculty system, you need to register with it. And I have given the wonderful people at St. Padarn's a document called FAQ Faculty. So faculty application, frequently asked questions. And hopefully within that, there will be a URL, a link to the faculty application system itself if you need to register. So registration is done at a diocesan level. So requests come into the DAC secretary. And the reason it was done like this is because the secretary will be familiar with your church, parish, ministry area, benefice, whatever. So this is a way for us to filter that the people who are registering are genuine applicants. So you're led through, it's not difficult, there's just a series of screens and you're led through the applications as you go along. The number of screens that you get to complete just depends on whether it's a List A, List B or full type application. So List A are works that don't require any official approval. And I should say official approval at the moment. The system will be modified soon, so we're planning some changes to make it easier. And what we'll be doing when we have that is DAC secretaries will grant permission to do very minor works. So works to enable digital ministry, as I've got on the presentation there, will probably not fall into a List A type application unless you already have equipment. And when I say equipment, I'm thinking digital ministry. So it'll be audio-visual equipment, so things that you might already have. So you might have a fold-down automatic projection screen. You might already have a projector installed. You might, you most definitely probably will have sound equipment installed. So it's that kind of thing that would enable, for example, perhaps a live service to be streamed, or a service to be recorded and then later uploaded perhaps to your own website. So List A's, as I say, like for like basis. So you may be able to get a List A under those circumstances, but please always speak to your DAC secretary just to make sure she'll be able to advise. So List B applications then, these don't give automatic approval. They require consultation with a DAC member or members. So it's not like a full application. When it comes into the DAC secretary, she will check it over, make sure that you've included as much description as you can, any supporting documentation. So depending on what the works are, she will then contact the appropriate DAC member, who will give a short report, and that will accompany the application, which is determined or approved by the diocesan registrar. So diocesan registrars are lawyers. Yep. So he makes the decision, or she makes the decision, whether to grant permission for that particular work. So the final type of application is the full one. So more or less exactly the same process as we had before the online system. So these applications, lots more forms, lots more supporting documentation. Doesn't have to be onerous to fill in. And the application itself is discussed at a DAC meeting. So DAC panel is a panel of experts, architects, archaeologists, local authority conservation officers, clergy, bell advisors, I should say, organ advisors, stained glass window advisors. So it's a very good panel of people who will then look at the technical aspects and then will make a recommendation to the Chancellor. So all this information goes before the Chancellor. Chancellors are judges, so some of them are QCs. So they will scrutinise the application almost like a case in a courtroom. So that they will look at the evidence presented to them, and they will look also to see if there's been any opposition. So members of the public can write in and express their own views. All full faculties have a 28-day notification period, and as though those of you already know this, you have to get the notice, the public works notice, outside the church, sometimes now on a diocesan website, and occasionally in a local newspaper. So again, beating the gong here, please speak to your DAC secretary, because he or she will be able to advise you what type of application or proposed works will come under, and also what supporting documentation you're going to need. So again, just thinking about digital ministry and faculty, most new works will require a full faculty. So this is the permanent installation of audio-visual equipment. You'll always need supporting documentation. So again, speak to your secretary. Make your DAC secretary your best friend. Send them a Christmas card. That's what I always say. as I hinted at earlier, they do go for consultation for faculties. Again, it depends on the type of work, but if it's a listed church that you have, it has to go to external agencies. So CADU maybe, local planning authorities, amenity societies, so if you have a Victorian church or a Georgian church, for example, and they have 28 days to respond, and the Chancellor will take their comments into consideration when he makes his determination of whether to approve or refuse the faculty. And another bit of gong banging here, always make sure that you complete the online statement of significance and statement of needs forms. The important thing with a historic building is to make sure that any works that you do not permanently damage the historic fabric of that building, if at all possible. Now, there are circumstances when that's unavoidable. So you need to look at what the significance, the history, the archaeology of your church is, and then you need to assess what the potential damage could be and to mitigate against it. So to minimise this, or even perhaps to look at another way to carry out the works. Statements of needs allow you to put your case, as it were. So you explain why you want to do this work, and it gives you a chance, gives you a voice that the Chancellor and the DAC will hear. So that's my plea. Always make sure that you submit a good statement of significance and a statement of needs forms. And then finally, this is in the supporting documentation that St Padarn's will be able to give you, but as a general rule for any AV installations, audiovisual installations, you will need an annotated plan of the church, so showing where the new items are going. Also, is there extra cabling? Are there extra sockets? Are there extra switches? You'll need to mark those on there. Photographs, so please photograph the areas where these items will be installed. So a specification or a quotation detailing the proposed works from a suitably qualified person. So it could be an AV company that are doing it, or it could be an electrician. It depends on the extent of the work. Details of the equipment. So if you've got a manufacturer's catalogue or specification, great. Because we need to know how big it is, you know, how obtrusive it will be. How is it going to be fixed as well to the wall? Are you going to have to drill holes or put brackets in? Think about things like colour and weight. If you're drilling into a historic wall, if it's a projector, if it's speakers, will the weight support that wall? What's the colour of these items? So you don't want bright pink ones. You probably won't get bright pink ones, but you don't want, say, black ones if your walls are lime washed white. So again, it's just to think about the impact of your works on your church. And I think that's all I'm going to say on the matter. So thank you very much for your time. There we go. And if I just get myself back there, I hope. There we go. How's that?
All right. Thank you so much for that, Tina. Really, really appreciate your time today. You've given us a very straightforward run through faculty, actually. I've been a minister for nearly 20 years and I managed to follow most of that. That's great. And I have great sympathy with you in dealing with people like myself sometimes. But some really good information there. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. You've given us some documents that we can put people onto. So that will be on the website as well. And I think Veronica and Jen might be able to post a link to some of that information as well by the end of the webinar. You've done a brilliant job because we've no questions that have come in during that. So I assume that you've answered people's questions as you've gone along. So very, very much appreciate your time today. And again, have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Cheerio, everybody.
And that takes us on to our final section today. And I'd like to introduce Emma for that. Now we're going to look at safeguarding. And again, one of the worrying comments, Emma, that came to me a little while back was that the usual safeguards, if you like, don't necessarily apply when you're ministering from home as when you minister within the building. So maybe you can just enlighten us a little. So welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Pnawn da pawb. Good afternoon, everybody. Mae'n pleser I weld gymaint afon ni heddiw 'ma. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here today. So I'm Emma Leighton-Jones, and I'm the lead safeguarding trainer at St Padarn's. And obviously I've been asked to talk to you today a little bit about safeguarding and digital ministry. So during this current pandemic, there have been significant changes in the way that faith groups engage with their communities, and obviously this poses challenges to adapt to safeguarding practices and obviously to meet new needs and requirements. How things have changed over the past months, I'm sure we all feel this difference. Many churches have launched or are still considering launching video content online and live streaming. Very much in this way, digital ministry via social media has become a way of continuing fellowship with those who are isolated, and you don't need me to tell you how important and vital it is to be able to provide that support to those individuals who are feeling isolated during these very difficult times. Restrictions on our lives can bring additional and heightened risks to many aspects of life for some children and adults, and can pose a challenge to those safeguarding them from abuse and neglect. So, absolutely in the face of what Chris has just said, now is not the time to become complacent, and we all know that. When it comes to safeguarding, it has its place, it's still important, and it still remains a priority for you to be considering. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes taking you through some of the basics. Is 10 minutes long enough? I can hear some of you asking. It's probably not, but there's guidance available on the Church in Wales website that can help you. Not just the safeguarding policy, but there's documents concerning COVID guidance on safeguarding and live streaming from home. And there's a new document about Zoom, actually, so do have a look. My colleague Veronica will be posting some of the links to the web pages as we go through. So I'm going to talk about something in particular. It's a one-page document that's on the Church in Wales website under COVID-19 guidance and digital resources for live streaming. Live streaming, that's a very good one, isn't it? It gives us the basics with regards to things to consider. I'll give you a few examples now, and we'll run through that. So you need to think about the platform that you're using, and have you worked out how its privacy settings work, and what information you're actually sharing when you're live streaming, for example. Think about your location in particular. So are you inadvertently sharing personal information or information about others in your household by what you've got behind you, for example? If you're broadcasting from a room in your house, then is anyone going to accidentally come in or intrude on that session? And what's the implication of that? For example, if it's children, for me, it's usually my cat, but that doesn't really provide a safeguarding problem for us. What about your audience? And who is your intended audience? Is it the public in general? Or are you thinking about restricting it to a particular group? And how are you going to do that? You're going to provide a lock on the remote room, if you like. So once everybody's in, you can lock it. Equally, you can provide passwords like we have done today. Think about the comments option as well and how you can best make use of that. And think about how appropriate it might be for what you're attempting to do, and is there a risk in using them? And am I asking you lots of questions? Yes, I am, because it's the road to thinking about the things that you need to do. So what about the live streaming itself? So who is your speaker? Who is being broadcast? And what's being broadcast? If it's an activity that you're broadcasting, whether it be a church service or prayer group, for example, then have you got the permission of those individuals that are taking part? Have they been given an option to consent to being filmed, for example? So a few things to think about there, in particular with that live streaming. So let's remember that social media is an excellent way to communicate when it's used properly. For those that are not familiar with it, however, it can seem strange, inhospitable, and sometimes even intimidating. When I think of the variety of platforms that can be used, those that leap out to me are Zoom for live streaming, or Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube. I haven't listed them all. There's many, many more. Each has its positives and some have pitfalls. So it's important to remember to consider which is the appropriate platform for the activity or the relationship that you're seeking to use it for. I want in particular to walk you through some things with regard to online activities at this point. That's activities to do with children, whether it be youth groups or Bible study, for example. These are things to think about. So firstly, and I know this is sometimes really difficult, try not to use personal accounts. Make sure that you use privacy settings for security. So understand those privacy settings in those different platforms that you can use. And there's lots of really useful information online for each platform, really. Again, this one is difficult. Try to use an organisational device to communicate with all young people. I know that's not always possible, especially in an institution like ours, but do try and think about it. Remember to use appropriate language, and remember what I was saying before about consent. So here we're talking about seeking consent from parents, carers, and even the children themselves. Have that conversation. The safeguarding policy is quite clear on this and states that if email and instant messenger programs and any social media sites are being used to communicate with young people, then parental permission must be sought. There's a special form, Form 5, consent form for electronic communication with young people. So that needs to be completed. So with all forms of communication, it's about thoughtfully communicating the right message and thinking about whether any concerns would be there for any parent or guardian, or even your line manager, for example, if actually we didn't do things in the right way. So when you seek that consent, then I think it's really important to explain what the activity is, why you're doing it online. It seems obvious, we're in a pandemic, but it's still important to talk about it and to actually explain what the benefits are, but also what the risks might be so that people are aware. Really important, this seems obvious, but conduct yourself the same way on the internet as you would face to face. Be aware of what you say, how you say it, and how things can be interpreted. So it might be a good start to provide guidelines and explain the boundaries for any meeting that you're having online. So include things like suitable language to be used, suitable attire in group meetings, and consideration of the environment. So no personal or intimate views. If you're going to be using breakout rooms, then where is that youth going to be for the whole session? So if the youth is in a bedroom, then I would have concerns about that. That's not really so impacted with the breakout rooms, it's for the whole session actually, but do think about these things. As a leader, then you should keep a log of group contact, including the date and the time, who was present, and an outline of what was discussed and how long that contact lasted. So essentially keep a log of what happened within that session and keep it securely. Ratios is something that's really important, and it keeps coming up time and time again. So the safeguarding policy, section 8, in fact, indicates that the ratios that are normally applied to church activities should be applied to online and electronic communication. So what that means is that 2 adults to every 10 children in church-related activities. So think about how you do that. And then if you've got an activity like this, but you're breaking people into breakout rooms, then you're going to need more than 2 adults, because you need those adults in breakout rooms as well, and an adult looking after the fort at home. So really do think about how the safeguarding policy can aid you with that. So why is everything that I've said important? Because in times of crisis, those who seek to exploit children and adults are quick to act and prey on their vulnerabilities. This can be particularly easy in online forums. And in fact, on the 14th of April, UNICEF issued an article concerning the increased risk of harm online to children in particular during this global pandemic. More than 1.5 billion children and young people have been affected by school closures worldwide. How that impacts on what I'm talking about is that this means they're spending much more time learning and socialising on virtual platforms, and that can leave them vulnerable to online exploitation. Equally interesting to me is the fact that this lack of face-to-face contact with friends can lead to a heightened risk-taking approach, such as sending sexualised images and texts. And increased and unstructured time online can expose children to harmful content, as well as a greater risk of cyberbullying. But moving away from online safety, what we do know is that abuse, conflict and violence can escalate when families face greater pressure and stress. We know that lockdown has proven to be a particularly stressful time for all, and this has disrupted routines, both positively and negatively. And it's important to be aware of how tensions can escalate to violence and abusive behaviour between families, parents and children. During this time, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline has seen a 25% increase in calls. In fact, only yesterday, the Safe Lives group, they have a website which Veronica will put on the chat for you, published new data gathered from survivors and services that show that demand for services is continuing to increase, despite 61% of survivors, that's 61%, not being able to reach out for support during lockdown. The figure is partly because these individuals weren't able to access the phone or online support, and that this might have been because the perpetrator was with them the whole time and they were scared of asking for help. So what can you do? What can we do? Well, firstly, if you're concerned that someone is in immediate danger, you need to call the police. If you're concerned that someone is coming to harm, but the danger is not immediate, then contact the safeguarding team for support. You can also think about signposting to sources of support, for example, Safe Lives and their website, but consider ways to do this that isn't going to alert any potential abusers and put victims at further risk. So putting links on our materials and our websites, that sort of thing is really important. There are a few key things as well that you can do to help. So be aware of the signs of exploitation and be vigilant. UK Safer Internet Centre and CEOP, which is the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command, they can help with this. There's lots of information that they have, and FAQs and how-tos, they're really useful. But take disclosures and take the concerns that you have seriously and refer these concerns to the safeguarding team. It's vitally important to ensure that you're aware of not only the Church and Wales safeguarding policy and procedures, but what to do and how to if you have concerns. So how to contact the safeguarding team. Essentially, what I want you to do today is treat this webinar as a beginning of a journey to discover what you need to do about ensuring those individuals that we come into are safe and that we continue the culture of a safe church, whether we're working in our homes, in our offices or actually in our church buildings. And again, my colleague Veronica will put up the safeguarding link onto our web page so that you can contact our officers. So our provincial safeguarding officers are Faye Howe and Wendy Lemon. So they deal with all the casework, and our provincial safeguarding manager is Dorian Davis, and he can be contacted with regards to general safeguarding concerns affecting the Church in Wales, or issues with regards to the safeguarding policy and procedures. I realise we've flown through it. There's probably more questions than answers, but I'm happy for you to come back to me at any point if you need to. But that's it from me. I sound like a newsreader.
Thank you, Emma. It's kind of like right over to the weather forecast now. That was a great link. Thank you for that. Just one question that somebody has sent in anonymously for you, Emma, if you're able to just answer that for us. If a child or a young person ends up in the background on a live broadcast from my home, do I then need to notify anybody about that?
It's not, well, let me take my other ear out. It's not so much about having to notify someone if that happens. And it would depend on how long that child is there and what actually that child is doing. So we're going to be exercising our personal judgment, and you'll note a lot in the safeguarding training, it is about personal judgment. So make a note of it, that what activity you were in, again, who was there, and if you have concerns, then speak to the safeguarding team. But generally for that scenario, it's about that planning beforehand and making sure that actually there is something you can do. Maybe just stick your video off immediately if that's the case, which isn't easy if you're the person that's leading whatever that event might be.
Thank you. So I suppose the overarching advice really is that if you've got concerns in any way, if you're worried at all about anything, then contact your safeguarding officer at church, and if not, of course, they can always get in touch at diocesan level or contact us. Sometimes just to put our minds at rest, I think, Emma, isn't it?
Absolutely. Talking about it is actually the most important thing. Not only does it raise the profile of safeguarding, but it ensures that we have those risks assessed in an effective manner. So keep talking about it and keep asking those important questions is what I would say.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you again so much for your time today. I noticed that we put some links into the chat as you've been talking, so I just encourage people to go to have a read through those, but certainly some very practical information that you've been able to share with us, Emma. But again, I think the overarching thing is if you're in any doubt, get in touch with somebody, share your worries, talk that through, because safeguarding obviously is as much about safeguarding us as it is about safeguarding young people and vulnerable adults. So it works all the way around. But thank you so much for your time today. Very much appreciated. So that was the final webinar in our series on digital ministry. I hope you've really found them of value, and a big thank you to everybody that's offered feedback to us as we've gone along, and the encouragement as well. It's the first time we've done a series like that, so it's been a learning curve for us as much as anybody else. I did mention earlier that we were going to continue with just one or two going on in the future as well. A lot of our attention at the moment is about the reopening of churches and the opportunities, hopefully, about being able to gather together in person more often. But obviously digital ministry, online ministry has still got a really important part to play in church going forward. So we want to keep revisiting this even as the landscape changes and the rules and regulations change as well. So to that end, I'm delighted that on September the 10th, Thursday, September the 10th, Liz Morgan is going to be running a webinar for us. Now, Liz is the Church Digital Champion for the Church of England, which is a wonderful job title. So Liz will be here, and together we're going to reflect really over the last 6 months and look at that landscape shift in ministry in the Church in Wales, and also maybe project forward a few months as well and see how Liz can see that playing out. So again, some food for thought there. So we hope you join us for that. The details are already on the Ministry Hub on the St. Padarn's website, and you'll be able to register that. But we'll let you know a little bit more about that nearer the time. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attendance today and for your attendance over this particular series. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.